For those that are here today, thank you for attending. Today we have Ling. Ling's a manager at Kearney and has been at Kearney for about a bit more than 2 years. He's also an MBS alum and graduated from MBS in 2017, I think. Ling has a pretty interesting background and done really all sorts of things, but I think he's come from more of a sales and marketing type background. But I will hand it over to him and let him introduce himself a bit.
No worries, thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think that's a very good intro. It's pretty much all the key points and key highlights. I guess, yeah, really happy to be here. When we're sitting in your position a couple of years ago, and really, yeah, the consulting club and the way that the clubs are structured with all these sessions have been really helpful in making sure that you get the best possible chance when you do go for the interviews. And yeah, happy to be here, and we can get stuck into it. All right, Sam, anything else? Otherwise, we can probably make a start, and we can probably leave more time for Q&A as well. So we'll try to go through the structured part pretty quickly.
Yep, go for it, mate.
No worries. All right. So quick overview. So we'll go through a general structure for probability cases. I'm sure you guys have seen these structures in the past, so I'm not going to harp on too much about the structure. More focused around giving you some practical advice on how to navigate the case, and also some pitfalls and sort of tips for the interview process itself, right? Because most people don't fail on the structure part here, right? They typically can put a structure up pretty easily, but it's really sort of the next steps and the next level down that really sets people apart in the interview process. So trying to give you as many tips about how to navigate that process and to make sure, again, to give you guys the best chance of getting a good outcome in your case interviews. We'll show you some general problem-solving frameworks as well, just to get you thinking about how at Kearney, at least, we think about problem-solving, and that working backwards from that is obviously it's a good starting point for any case, regardless if it's a profitability case or a different case. And then we'll just we'll wrap up the last 15, 20 minutes sort of with a few tips on CV and cover letters, because there's been a lot of questions around that. And again, more focused on the practical parts about what we look for, what are the key things to make you stand out, what's really going to make you pop against everyone else when we go through the CV screening process. Cool. Any questions before we get started? All right, we'll jump into it. So, profitability, pretty basic kind of problem if you think about it. Very high level structure. It's revenue minus costs, right? I think that you guys would have all seen that. The key thing for me when I go through a profitability case with an interviewee, or even when I'm being interviewed, it's really looking at not just do you understand the problem, but can you dig deep into the problem and break it down into its core components and then build the answer back up, right? And the key thing here is taking the MECE approach and being holistic across all the components within the business. So when you start breaking down at the top level, revenue and cost is fine, right? That at a high level is fine. But really it's then about how do you then go to the next level down. And it's really important to get into the context of the case and not apply generic models. So what I mean by that is think about the business when it's given in you. So typically in a case situation, you'll be given the background of the business. You know, this is a pharmaceutical company. They operate in Australia and New Zealand, and they produce X amount of products. And they operate in the vaccine market, for example, right? That could be the background. So straight away, things that should be triggering your mind is, okay, it's a localized market, right? We're not looking international. We're looking at Australia, New Zealand, localized market. Secondly, think through, it's a business with lots of regulations, right? So apply what you know generally. Pharmaceuticals, highly regulated. The barriers to entry are going to be high. It's not like making pencils, right? Where there's probably very little regulations. You just got to get a product out there, right? Also, you guys should just apply your general knowledge of these industries. Pharmaceuticals likely to have high costs in terms of development, and then there's a need for protection on the actual IP in order to monetize over a long period of time. So these are the kind of things you should be starting to think about already, and then think about it as, do they just do development, or do they do development and manufacturing, right? And then do they do development, manufacturing, and distribution? So start thinking about all these different components that go into the business and what the business actually does. It'd be a very different way to structure this if it was, for example, you were talking about a law firm, right, competing in Melbourne, because it's a service-based product, right? There's no real startup costs apart from recruiting, and then your market is even more narrow because it's probably based on a city or a specific industry within a particular market, right? So these are the kind of things to start thinking about already, and now we'll start to frame up what is the drivers of revenue and what are the drivers of costs. So we go back to the pharmaceutical example, and revenue is going to be the selling of the drug, but then you need to understand, how do they actually sell the products? Do they distribute, or what's their point of sale? Right, these are kind of questions that you need to start thinking about straight away to try and sort of build some idea of how you're going to go to the next level down. On the cost side for pharmaceuticals, again, you got to understand what are they doing? Are they just R&D? Right? Do they do R&D and manufacturing? Because manufacturing is a very different cost base to just R&D. And then you need to know the scale and scope. Are they a niche player? Do they go through a whole range of different industries? Are we just talking about one division of their business, or are we talking about the entire business as a whole? So these kind of questions in your mind will help you focus in and narrow down what type of environment they're operating in, and help you frame your thinking, right? Which is really, really important. And that's what we're looking for in a consultant, because when they come in and get dropped into a client situation, you may know nothing about the industry, right? You may know nothing about the client, and it's really important to really have that get the understanding of the context very early on, so that you can actually properly structure your problem when you're actually on a real project with a client, and also work backwards. Right? We often talk about hypothesis-led problem solving, which basically means you have a solution in mind before you start to tackle the problem, right? So as soon as the case gets thrown at you, start thinking about what are some of the likely problems, and what are some likely solutions straight away, right? And you can think about things that you hear from the news. You can draw from studies that you've had at uni through your different cases or your different subjects. Right, and think through all the subjects that you've done, right? Marketing, operations, strategy, all the different subjects, and then how they could potentially be, one of the drivers for the problem, right? Is it let's look at if we take that pharmaceutical example, and let's say they're in the vaccine space. In the news, all I've been hearing these days is production restrictions and distribution issues, right? That could be a problem, right? And a lot of these cases, they all come from real life situations. So I know my case personally, when I give it as an interviewer, it's a case which I did about 1.5 years ago, and it's something that happened in the market in real life. It was a market event which most people would know of. I won't give you the details of the company, but it's something that was in the news. So a lot of the things you can start thinking about, recent things that are happening, and depending on how new or how old the case is that the person's bringing up, you likely already have some insights about what the cause and what the solution actually is already. And the last thing is always be MECE, right? For those of you that may not know, it's mutually exclusive, but exhaustive. So what that means is basically you need to make sure that you cover everything. And so it's completely exhaustive of everything that could be causing the problem. But at the same time, each sub-component has to be mutually exclusive, right? They can't overlap, because then you are doing more work than is needed and potentially overlapping your solution. So that's just some very high-level things to start framing your thinking at the start of the case and how to get into it. And this also frames how you will potentially ask questions. So you'll get the case typically, and they'll ask you to probably initial question, and then you'll probably go away and structure some kind of framework But then before you do into level 2, you need to really go back and ask a few more questions, like the ones I've been talking about: industry, scope, market, and really define what the problem is before you can actually probably finish your structure. So any question on that? Otherwise, we can move on. Cool. All right, move on. So,
hey, sorry. Can I just ask a quick one?
Yep, no worries, Richard.
Took me a while to get it off mute, but with the clarifying questions,
Yes.
I do find this a bit of a challenge in my thinking to ask something that's just really clarifying those high-level things, but it's not actually getting down too much, so that the interviewer might think that I've sort of haven't got a structure and I'm just sort of, grasping at straws. So any sort of tips about, like, I think you've given some good ones here about the types of clarifying questions. So it might be about digging into the industry a bit and the scope of the operation, that sort of thing. Any other sort of guidance on where to stop with the clarifying questions?
Yeah, so when you're asking clarifying questions, typically ask as much as you need to form your structure. Right? So what I would say is try to get context first. Right? Understand context. Context questions are always welcome. Right? It helps to let the interviewer know that you're thinking about the problem holistically and not just focusing on the particular elements of the problem. Right? It lets the interviewer know that you are trying to be as broad as possible to start with, and then narrow back down in, right? And then take the hints from the interviewer. So typically, if you start going too deep in your questions, they will give you hints that that's too deep, and they'll tell you to pause. They'll tell you to say, let's talk about that next. So don't be afraid to dig deep, but also be mindful of the time and make sure that you do get all the information that you need, working downwards to structure your problem. So definitely don't just focus, for example, if probability, it's a probability question, revenue and cost, ask questions on both sides, right? Don't just go straight into revenue and just dig deep there, because then you're going to miss out on the cost component. But at the same time, don't just focus on costs, go to revenue, right? So make sure you sort of have the structure in your head, and there's nothing stopping you from asking questions once you build that front structure, right? So probability, do your top layer, revenue and cost. Then start asking questions about each one, and then go one level deep, right? Then go to price and quantity, and then variable or fixed costs, right? So then you can go one level deep and start talking about that. And so nothing stopping you from asking questions at 2 levels if you need to. At the same time, because you already got a structure in place, you're already showing the interviewer that you can structure a problem.
Right, and I guess if you do get a bit of a hint of, we're going to talk about, or we might touch on that a bit later, and sort of get that hint to move on with creating a structure, it might be that you sort of touched on something that's sort of critical to the case, which has got a whole heap of data and analysis around it anyway, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Thanks.
No worries. All right. So the very typical way of breaking it down is what you see on the page right now, but this is a trap, right? This is what you'll see in probably every textbook case that you get, and when you go through your practices, a lot of these kind of structures will come up as a solution. But keep in mind that knowing this is good, but don't just apply this to every single problem. So one of the key things that's going to make you stand out versus every other interviewer that's going to go through the process is if you can think creatively and apply specifics of the case context to the problem, right? So in this situation, let's say we're back to our example of a pharmaceutical company making vaccines in Australia and New Zealand, right? When you go to the next level down, right, you can think about price and quantity, but then think about what other restrictions may be applied to those particular components, right? Quantity may not just mean the quantity that they're actually producing. It may mean the quantity that they've promised to the government, right? Or there might be other factors influencing the price, like it's a pre-negotiated deal, right, with the government, right? These kind of things, even though they probably won't change the framework in the situation, it's probably still going to be revenue is driven by price versus quantity, right? But start thinking about how those particular components will be different for a particular business, right? And you may want to even add a layer in here before you go to price versus quantity. So, for example, if they're producing 2 vaccines, let's say they're producing a flu vaccine and they're developing a new COVID vaccine, right? Before you go to price and quantity, you might break it down into product sub-segments, right? You might want to go, I'm going to look at, I only got 2 products, so I'm going to break the product down for my revenue drivers to my general flu vaccine, which I've been making for years, and then my COVID vaccine, which I've just developed as a new product, right? So before you go to the price quantity, you've broken it down because those 2 things may have 2 very different price drivers and 2 different quantity drivers, right? So apply a bit of thinking before you put the structure down. And when you put your structure down, make sure you walk the interviewer through your structure. Depending on how interviews go, and hopefully we'll be back to face-to-face interviews next year. But if it's over Zoom or whatever, just write down on a piece of paper, right? And just like put it to the screen, be like, here's my boxes. Make sure you put big boxes in there, right? And as long as you got some boxes in a tree format, 99% of the time, like the interview's gonna be like, oh, this guy definitely knows what he's talking about, right? Because he's put boxes in a tree format. Like that's the number one thing that you do, right? And to be honest, they probably won't be able to read your writing, but they'll just see boxes on a tree, right? That's a good starting point. And then walk through and talk through each of your boxes, and you're thinking about why you've done that, right? Typically, we're not really, we don't need you to get to the exact textbook answer. We're more interested in how you think. So in the interview training that we get for when we actually become an interviewer, we get told the key thing that we're looking for, what we're trying to do is trying to like unscrew your brain and really peer inside and see how this person operates and thinks, right? It's quite sort of confronting, but that's really what we're trying to delve deep into your mind to understand whether you have the right level of thinking and logic and the process that you have to be a good consultant, right? It doesn't mean we're not really testing your intelligence because you guys are all smart people, or you just wouldn't be in this situation, right? We already know you're smart, you already got good grades. It's more about now, how do you think? Do you think in a structured way, which is what we really need from a good consultant? So talk through your thinking, right? I'm thinking about the problem in this way. I want to break it up in this situation. Does that make sense? Ask the question back to the interviewer as well, right? Do as much as you can to let them give you hints and guidelines. Now, that's on the revenue part. If we just quickly talk about the cost component, the cost component is really, I guess, an area where variable costs and fixed costs are a good starting point, but not always the right answer, right? Definitely not always the right answer. Think about your industry and what you're doing, right? And you can break it up into a lot of different ways. So, for example, in let's take the pharmaceutical example. One of the cases I did when I was doing my interviews, I didn't break it up into variable costs and fixed costs because it really wasn't the right way to look at it, right? I broke it up into value chain, right? So I looked at manufacturing costs, distribution costs, and other point of sale costs, right? That is still a MECE structure, right? I'm covering all the cost components up until to deliver the entire value chain of what my business is doing, right? And each of those particular value chain items had different drivers. Now, I broke into that because originally my thinking was that it was a distribution cost problem, right? That I already had that solution in my mind, and I wanted to test that solution in a very focused and targeted way. So that's why I broke it up in that particular area, so I can then narrow it down onto the distribution costs, right? If you think about that, distribution costs that have both a variable component and a fixed cost. So the trucks and the depot is a fixed cost, right? That you already have that capitalized. Then the variable cost is actually the fuel and the people that you need to actually deliver and operate the warehouse, right? And if I had broken up into variable fixed costs, I may need to touch on both those boxes as I'm trying to solve the overall problem, right? And that splits your focus and may not always be the right approach. So this is where really think about the context of what is driving the problem. Try to have a solution in your head already at this point in time, and that really helps you to frame what you actually put into this level 2 the buckets of how things are going, and you don't get zoned into this generic approach of variable and versus fixed cost, because that's not always the right answer. Does that make sense? Cool. And the other thing is, I'll say is, try to get some direction here before you go to level 3, right? Level 3 is always probably the guts of the problem, right? Here, if on a generic structure, if you look at variable costs, you go your cost per unit versus your unit sold, right? And you got your COGS, and that could be where the problem is. It could be a fixed cost. You got too much, your fixed cost is too high, or whatever, right? But before you go into that next level, ask the questions back to the interviewer, like, am I on the right track? Like, it's okay to ask that question, right? Because that's what you do on client side. When you're on client side, you don't just build an issue tree and go, I'm going to look at your fixed costs, right? It's usually you try to collaborate with the clients and go, hey, am I in the right direction? Like, am I off kilter? Like, is this generally what you think is the problem as well? You take this exploratory journey with them rather than coming and saying, just from looking at your numbers, I know it's this problem, right? Because it's not always the case, right? And there's always compounding pieces of information that help stitch the story together and to build that particular story of how you actually get to the problem, right? And then once you've got your structure in place, you've probably already done this throughout this initial phase of the problem, but it's really this sub point here about, like, which branch of the tree are you going into, right? And that is just an open question. Usually the interviewer will lead you towards which element they should be, and take the hints as you go along. And typically this is at a stage where they'll give you more data or more exhibits to try and drill in on what the problem is, right? The key thing I will tell you at this point in time is, once you go down that path, let's say it's a fixed cost problem, and they give you a bunch of data on what the fixed cost base is. As you go down that analysis, don't forget about your structure. So what I mean by that is, you may solve that branch, and then you still have to come back and make sure that you rule out that the problem is not also driven by another branch, right? When we go through and trim the problem and narrow the scope, that's good, but make sure you're very clear that there are no outstanding questions or things that are left on the other branches. And any assumptions that you make sure you make a note that it's an assumption. And when you roll your problem back up in the summary at the very end, this is most of the time the most critical element that you can demonstrate that you are a structured thinker. So when I roll up problems at the end, I roll up in a way of, like, we've explored it, your fixed problems, it was a warehousing problem, your recommendation is to do X based on the data that we've shown. But as we go back, we explored the cost component of it, but we made this assumption about revenue. If we need to, we can do a bit more analysis on revenue, but we made the assumption, that's what we moved on. And given more time, we can probably have a deeper look there as well, right? As you go back and explain the problem and summarize the problem, work your way back up the tree. And as you work back up the tree, call out all the assumptions and all the other things that you've actually found as you go through the case. And that shows the interviewer that you're very well structured, right? You're actually going back to your structure as you solve the problem, right? And don't be afraid to prompt as you reach the conclusions of a particular area, right? They may give you a hint, like, okay, let's look at this focus area first, right? Once you've gone there and goes, okay, we look at this focus, should we look at the other area, or should we just make an assumption about it, right? And they'll give you a hint. They'll say, oh no, let's assume that that's okay. Let's keep going on this path, or let's assume that's okay, and let's double click on this particular component, right? So always refer back to your structure. Always refer back to your tree, and then always refer back to your assumptions as you go through the problem, especially as you do the roll up at the end, right? And again, pick up your notebook, be like, we've gone through this part, now let's go through this part, right? Just walk them through. So consultants are very visually oriented people, and all they do, like, day in, day out, is look at, like, PowerPoints, right? That's all they do. So that's a very powerful way of communicating rather than just verbally communicating, is to use some visuals as you are solving the problem, right? When I do math problems, when I was doing it in person, I used to write big numbers and like make it very clear as each step, x, 1 times 5 equals this, right? I'll write it out and I'll step through it like I'm explaining it to a 4-year-old, right? But at the same time, that's actually quite valuable. But that's how we actually go through it with clients as well. We don't just go, here it is. We just go step by step, graphically, visually, using slides to show them where we're at, right? And do a lot of pointing if you're in the session with them. Point to the areas that you're looking at on the problem tree. These are kind of natural cues which will help you communicate better, right? So I'll cover this in slide 6 where we talk about CV tips, but when we start off, what we do is we screen you on paper, right? And then when you get to the interview, we're really testing for 2 things: communication, problem solving, structured thinking, usually one category, and the third one is cultural fit, right? So cultural fit, you can't really study for, right? You're fit or you're not a fit, right? And sometimes it's not a reflection of you as a person. It's just, are you a good fit for the firm, right? And are you able to adapt well in the firm environment with the people that are currently in the firm? The second part in terms about communications, what I talked about: be clear, use cues, use graphics, right? Be articulate in how you speak. Talk about the structure in a structured way. Actually go back and name the component that you're talking about before you talk about it. Right? We're talking about costs, we're talking about variable costs, and then go down a little bit deeper. That's something you can train for, and hopefully you'll get into the practice of doing that. The structured thinking, right? Once you get a tree on paper and you are able to walk people through that tree, that pretty much is going to tick the box for structured thinking, right? The next part is probably, in addition to structured thinking, is critical thinking, right? So being inquisitive and questioning. So it's a good thing to question all these blocks on the page, right? Don't just lead down one path. Go back and question each of the components, because that will actually tick that second box of, well, this person is actually being thorough, this person is thinking about the problem holistically, and this person is being broad in their thinking, right? They're not just being narrowed in, they're having some kind of creativity in how they approach the problem, and not just applying a generic framework which they would have read in a casebook and just practice 50 times, right? Because that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for someone more than that. Any questions? Cool. All right. I understand I'm talking a lot, so if you do have any questions, jump in. A few other things to look at. I don't have a slide on this, but I'll talk briefly about when you get shown exhibits. Right? So when you get shown exhibit, it's going to be some kind of chart typically, or you could be given some numbers. Right? Most important thing, write it down. Make sure you know exactly what the numbers are, and ask people if you don't understand based on the industry that you're in. Right? Because a lot of things, I think I've got a toilet paper case. I have no idea what how toilet paper is manufactured or like distribute or market, all right? But ask questions. So if they give you something like, or use acronyms like, they go, this is a particular type of cost, right? It's a gluing agent, and this is a used to compound the paper together, right? And you may not know nothing about it, so ask about it. It's like, how expensive is this particular component, right? How important is this particular component? Right? Typically, everything they give you is probably meaningful in some way. But at the same time, when you get given an exhibit, make sure you look out for the red herrings, right? There's going to be things that throw you off. So don't take everything that they give you as something that needs to be explored. Make sure the number one thing that you do is prioritize all the information you get given to you. Right? So take all the information down, write it down, and pick the piece of information which you think are the most interesting and also the most insightful and meaningful. And that's typically going to be driven by what you think the solution to the problem is, right? So if you think that it's a warehousing fixed cost distribution problem, right, then don't worry about the stuff when they talk about fuel prices, right? Because that's not part of the problem, right? If you go back to your structure, that's going to be in your variable costs. It's not going to be in your fixed cost for warehousing, right? But when they give you maybe the cost to the cost to actually replace or to redevelop the facility, to building new technology to automate the warehouse, that is very important, right? That is going to be critical to how you solve the case. So really boil down within the gamut of information and data that you're given, what is the most important, and don't be afraid to ask for clarifying questions like, what does this particular acronym mean? Like, what do you mean when you say, the cost per rack? Like, what does that actually mean? Like, how does that actually get tied into the cost of the warehouse? These kind of things you're not going to know about every single industry that they throw at you. So don't be afraid to ask questions along the way. And the other thing is, always stick to the data. Don't bring in external knowledge to the case. Right, that is very important. Always take your numbers from what's given to you, and anything which you estimate or you make an assumption about, write it down and explain clearly why you made the estimation. Right, and there's nothing wrong with making estimations. We encourage it, and sometimes it's necessary to actually get to the root of the problem. But make sure you write it down and explain why you made that assumption. We're not worried about whether you get the assumption right or wrong. We're actually more worried about how you thought about the problem to come up with an assumption. Right? It's all about how you think, not about what that final outcome is. Right? Because in reality, when you get to a client and you're working on a real project, the assumptions are all tested. Right? You have a team of researchers that test assumptions, and your team will test the assumptions to make sure that the assumptions are valid. And you will also go back to the client, same as what you do in the interview. Goes, we're going to make the assumption as we go through analysis. Is that okay with you? Right? Does that make sense? Is that accurate? We'll do the stress testing and we'll go through the process. So here, it's about how you come up with the assumptions rather than what the assumption actually is. And finally, when you go through and you're analyzing the data and then you're trying to determine the root cause of the problem, don't be afraid to actually come to a conclusion, right? A lot of people I see, like especially probably at the undergrad level, not as much in the MBA level, but when I interview undergrads, they'll come in and they're not sure of the answer. They think they got the answer, but they're not sure of the answer, and they'll just pause. They'll be like this stunned rabbit and just sit there and be like, are we at the end of the case, right? The end of the case is the end of the case when you make a recommendation, right? So you got to have some kind of conclusion. So make sure you get to the conclusion and articulate the conclusion, and don't be afraid to stand by the conclusion. And you might be wrong, but as long as your conclusion makes sense and is justified by the analysis that you've done, you may have got the number 100% wrong, right? You may have missed the math step, or you got the answer wrong, and you got to an answer of 100 million versus 10 million, right? So it's a tenfold error. Now, in a real life project, you probably get, you climb fire if you get it 10 times wrong. But here, it won't really matter, because if you then have a conclusion which makes sense based on your result, that's fine, right? That's fine. Because what I'll do is I'll ping you for doing the maths wrong, for missing a step on the maths, but I'm going to say this guy can draw a conclusion, and this person can actually take data and come to a recommendation which makes sense, right? It's about the process, not about the getting to the answer. So to that extent, I'll go on to the next slide here. Any problem, regardless of profitability or any other problem, it could be a market entry problem, it could be a PE problem, it could be any kind of, it could be a cultural problem, right? Which we're seeing more and more these days. It's really about having some kind of approach which makes sense with some kind of framework. So here, this is the Kearney problem-solving framework. Overarching issue, which is your headline problem. Here, it's profitability. Then you go into your main issues. Main issues here, cost and revenue, pretty standard, right? And then you can see that there can be sub-issues here, but here you're already starting to form hypotheses, right, of what's causing some of these underlying issues, right? This is what I was talking about at the start when ask questions, have a point of view, right? This is already where you, based on information already have, start to form your opinion, right? And then the next level is getting data and then getting findings, right? So the data is going to be the process of interviewers giving you pieces of exhibits and analysis for you to do analysis. And what you're doing analysis is actually proving your hypothesis, right? You may say, and generally the best interviewers come through and they'll tell me, Ling, I think this is a cost problem, and I think it's centralized around the distribution because of the context you've given me. All right, I'll go, fantastic, here's a piece of data. And then they'll come back and go, so based on the data, my initial hypothesis I think is correct. Yeah, you have a problem here. And based on the data, I think my findings are X, and I think we should do this to try and potentially fix the problem. And also, in addition to having this particular solution, we should also consider risk A, B, C, and D. And these are some potential mitigations to risk A, B, C, and D to implementing the problem, right? And then they'll go back up and they go, now that we've looked at this, right, maybe we can also explore the revenue side to try and increase profitability as well to help the CEO with their problem overall, right? That is a very well structured answer that touches all the components which I'm looking for: structured thinking, being able to communicate clearly, referring back to the framework, being hypothesis driven, always knowing exactly what they're doing, being very focused, but at the same time covering the breadth of the problem, not just being narrow-minded, right? So that is generally a good structure to follow for Kearney especially, but I'm pretty sure that this kind of structure is going to be well received across any kind of consulting firm that you work in, because it really tests the same skills that all the consulting firms are looking for when they do this, right? And the key thing is MECE, right? You've probably heard that acronym a million times, right? Just be sure that your solution is MECE, and you can test that pretty easily in your own thinking. And a good thing I tell people who ask me, it's like, how do we practice? How do we get used to this? Like, just do it in your everyday life, right? Yeah, the wife asks you, what do you want for dinner tonight? Yes. Well, let's take a MECE approach to this, right? Would you like to stay in or go out? All right, I want to go out. Okay, let's go out. Let's do you want to go within 5Ks or more than 5Ks? Right? And then be like, all right, within 5Ks, do we want to have Asian food, or do we want to have Italian food, or do we want to have other? By throwing other, you automatically being MECE, right? So always have the other right in there, because you're always being MECE. And they go, all right, Asian food. All right, let's split down to Asian food. Like, what do we want? Do we feel like something that's hot and spicy, or do we feel like something that's nice and refreshing, or do we feel like something else, right? Or we just throw in something else, right? Don't practice that. Your wife's probably gonna look at you and be like, or your partner, or your husband, or whoever is gonna be like, what are you doing, right? But it's a good process to just run it through in your mind, and maybe don't do it out loud, right? But it helps you to get into that mindset, right? And like leading up to your actual interviews, it's a really good way to just keep that sort of cadence going, right? Because once you get the cadence right, once you get the mechanics of the case right, then you can really focus on what really is going to be tested in terms of differentiation is, how you actually think. Can you actually dig down and find the problem, right? Get the mechanics right first. Once you get the mechanics right, you can have brain space to think about the other things. If you're always worried about, am I getting the mechanics right? You don't have enough time to actually go and think about the problem itself, right? All you're going to do is being nervous, like, did I draw the right box, right? Am I missing my approach, right? So elevate yourself from that, and then you'll be in a much better position.